Greetings fellow Kerbalnauts, this is Brad Wistance with something that is not the next installment in the Odyssey by Bill series. I decided to make this separate because it didn't really fit into the narrative of the story, and I wanted to do it as a voiceover video. The objectives of this mission are to make it a grand tour which will land on every moon and every planet. It's going to be single launch, it's going to be unrefueled, it's not going to use ISRU, and most uniquely it's going to return every part that it launched with back to Kerbin at the end. The one exception to this is the Eve lander, as some of you might have guessed. Before starting the mission, I want to go briefly over the different modules that make up the modular lander system. The first part is the Ion Tug, which will land on every body except for Eve, Tylo, Lathe, and Duna. It lacks its own electrical power generation for the engine, so there is a solar pack for the inner system, and 2 battery packs with an RTG for the outer system. It only has a small xenon tank on its own, so there are 2 additional fuel tanks for more range. On the other side there is a command module, so the pilot has somewhere to sit during interplanetary transfers. And next to it is a tug, which can be operated independently and is good for pushing the larger dedicated landers. Down on this end is the first of the dedicated landers. This is the Tylo lander with a conventional Terrier engine. The small one is the Duna lander with 2 of the Ant engines. This is a Rapier-engined Lathe lander. And on the end is the one exception to our completely recovered rule. This is an Eve lander, which is disposable one use, but I'm okay with that because I have not seen anyone fully reuse an Eve lander yet. The mission begins with an SSTO cargo plane, which will take all the modules to low Kerbin orbit. It uses 5 Rapier engines and 1 LVN engine. Getting those Rapier engines in 5-way radial symmetry took some amount of effort, but I eventually got it to be at least pretty close. As this is not a low mass mission, I was not puritanical about using the minimum amount of Rapier engines possible, and it can therefore take a steeper approach to orbit than I do normally. It does, however, still take some time to pick up speed at sea level before climbing, and it does narrow out at around 10 kilometers like the other missions do. At this point we are in space and a little more burning to circularize, and we will be in low Kerbin orbit. Our first expedition from LKO will include Eve, Gilly, and Moho. This will mean assembling the modular lander as well as including the dedicated lander for Eve. The assembly is done by using the Kerbal pilot's EVA pack to push all the parts around until they are in position. This took some time, so I will leave you with a little bit of a montage here. We are in LKO and assembled for our first expedition to Eve and then Moho. The ejection burn to Eve is spread out over 10 burns at periapsis, which allows the craft to still do an efficient and accurate maneuver despite the very low TWR. It should be noted that this craft requires solar power to run. This did not pose a problem with this ejection, but it will make some other burns later very interesting. The injection burn by Eve proved to be a bit of a puzzle, because I could not aerobrake inside the atmosphere due to the fragile craft, and I could also not do a retrograde burn at periapsis because I was shadowed by Eve from the sun. I therefore did some of the retrograde burn before passing behind Eve, and some of it after. This is surely less efficient than doing a burn at periapsis, but I was still able to do it without using an excessive amount of fuel. I discovered over the course of this mission that I had over-engineered the amount of delta V available for orbital maneuvers quite a lot. With the great complexity of this mission, I was okay with this. I wanted to make absolutely certain I did not run out of fuel. As we were now in stable orbit around Eve, it was ready for the next step of the mission, which was to take the large Ion Tug, which was no longer necessary, and to fly it directly back to Kerbin. This would save the effort and fuel necessary to fly it all the way out to Moho and back. Ejecting the tug earlier than I needed it to also allowed me to find an intersection with Kerbit that was not on the immediate orbit, but several orbits later. The first landing of the mission would be on Eve's moon Gilly. The gravity on Gilly is so weak that a Kerbal with an EVA pack could easily go to it and land on it and reach orbit again. However, I did feel that this violated at least the spirit of a landing, and decided to do every landing with a real lander. Due to the limitations of the solar power generation, I had only about 2/3 of the maximum thrust of the Ion engine available, but due to the weak gravity of Gilly, this proved no problem. It also proved no problem that I had foolishly decided to place the solar powers at the back of the craft, because I could easily turn the craft over and land on the nose. I neglected to fit this to the right spot when I went to Moho, which proved for a little bit more difficult of a challenge. Now back in orbit around Gilly, we are going to rendezvous back with the craft, which is still in elliptical orbit around Eve, and we will be ready to land on the big purple planet. Those familiar with orbital maneuvers, rendezvous, and gravity assists might notice that I have left a lot of small burns and corrections out for the sake of time. This video would probably last about 5 hours if I had included all of them. Our next stop will be the planet of Eve, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the one spot where the lander is not reusable. The reason why Eve is so difficult to land on and recover is due to the high loss of delta V due to both gravity and air drag. It is vaguely just barely possible to take a single stage craft from the surface of Eve and get it back to circular orbit around Eve. However, this can only be done from taking off from a particular mountain, and the difficulties of actually landing such a craft on that mountain while dealing with the shock heating and other challenges of landing on Eve would be very daunting, and I would be both very surprised and very impressed if someone managed to pull it off. I don't want to say it's impossible, though, because that's when people like to prove you wrong. Our landing spot is specifically targeted towards that mountain that I mentioned earlier. Going backwards in reverse allows us to take advantage of a heat shield mounted at the rear of the craft, and is made possible by a pair of elevons that are mounted in reverse. This large mountain is not exactly on the equator, but close enough, and is almost 8,000 meters tall, which greatly reduces the challenge of taking off again. The large amount of delta V necessary to get from the surface of Eve back to orbit, as well as the challenge of dealing with the shock heating on the way down, makes Eve a very intriguing and challenging destination, and is one of my favorites. Fans of the Odyssey by Bill series can know that the next installment will bring Bill back to the surface of Eve. I won't give you guys any more spoilers than that, and I have no idea when I'll be done with it. The Eve Ascent craft is 2-stage and uses a toroidal aerospike for the first stage and a spark engine for the second stage. This is almost an exact carbon copy of the Eve craft I used in a previous video. The only change is the wing design, which had to be made a little bit less wide to be able to fit into the Mk3 cargo bay. The heat shield on the rear is explosively detached by the thrust from the toroidal aerospike engine. The landing gear are detached normally immediately after takeoff. At this point, I climb quite steeply to get quickly out of the thick lower atmosphere of Eve, and then I begin to cut the thrust on the aerospike engine so I don't overheat on the way up. The first stage is explosively detached by the thrust from the spark engine, which then had just enough delta V to push us to a circular orbit around Eve, and we are treated to a very pretty sunrise in the nice toxic atmosphere of Eve. The Eve lander has performed its last act, which is to rendezvous with the main modular craft. Jeb can now climb back aboard, and we are ready to eject for our next destination of Moho. Due to its low orbit around Kerbal and high inclination, the biggest challenge in going to Moho is to try to match inclination with it. Matching inclination with Moho when you eject from Eve will greatly decrease the amount of injection burn necessary. The injection at Moho again had a periapsis on the dark side of the planet, and I therefore had to split the injection burn on either side of the planet. Now in stable orbit around Moho, the Moho lander will detach, use the auxiliary xenon tank to fly to low Moho orbit. where it will then undock with the tank to decrease mass, land on MOHO, take off again where it will then rendezvous with the tank, and then fly back to the rest of the modular craft. MOHO has the strongest gravity of any body that I will land on with the Ion engine, which is made possible by the high amount of solar electrical generation available. At this point, I realized the solar panels were mounted on the wrong side, and I would need to get creative to not damage them upon landing. After a short stint on the surface of MOHO, I decided it was good to avoid any potential skin cancer and make it quickly back to the crew module. I should note that the ability to gather solar power was quite a big difference, and despite being the heaviest gravity of any planet that I landed on with the Ion lander, I did not even need the second Ion engine to have the amount of TWR necessary to land. After regaining circular orbit around MOHO, I then rendezvoused with the auxiliary xenon tank that had been left in low MOHO orbit, and then with the crew module, which is on elliptical orbit around MOHO. Throughout this whole time, the heavy Ion Tug has been flying back to Kerbin, and at this point was almost ready to re-rendezvous with the mothership in low Kerbin orbit. Instead of heading directly back to Kerbin, we will be doing a gravity assist near the planet Eve, which will decrease the total amount of delta V necessary to get there, as well as making each burn a lot more manageable. While the large amount of excess delta V I had meant that doing a gravity assist wasn't necessary in this case, gravity assists are always fun to do, particularly when going from MOHO, where you can use the assist to cancel out your undesired inclination and turn it into desired velocity. This is also a powered gravity assist. I did a burn slightly after reaching periapsis, which allowed me to correct my orbit to reach Kerbin on the first orbit after ejecting from Eve. Once next to Kerbin, I did an injection that consisted entirely of a retrograde burn and no aero braking. I am not entirely sure why I did it this way, but I had so much extra fuel that it didn't make much of a difference. After rendezvousing with the mothership, I was ready to put the modular craft back together for its next expedition, which would go to the planets of Drace, Duna, and its moon Ike. Since the only dedicated lander necessary on this leg was the small lander for Duna, I did not need the heavy Ion Tug for this leg, and as a result this was by far the lightest expedition from the mothership. I also did not bring any solar power generation on this trip, and therefore I needed many burns at periapsis using the battery and the RTG to power it. While the burns from Kerbin were all small enough that I was able to use just the electrical energy stored in the battery, this was not the case for some of the later burns, which you will see when I get to Drace. Duna combines a small size and actually having an atmosphere, which makes it a very easy planet to aerobrake on, and I was able to aerobrake into a captured orbit without doing any rocket burns whatsoever. Indeed, aerobraking on Duna was so easy that I almost inadvertently landed the whole craft on the surface of Duna, which would have stranded our poor pilot. After braking down to low Duna orbit, I was ready to detach the Duna lander and pick out a good landing spot. While I did not need to land anywhere specific, I did want to land somewhere on a higher-ish elevation so the craft had enough fuel to get back to orbit. I aimed in the general vicinity of some highlands and activated the parachute, which made for one of the easier landings of the mission. I did, however, need to make sure I did not land directly on the fragile engines. After stocking our pilot up on his daily nutritional value of iron, I was ready to take back off again and make it to low Duna orbit. I had just enough fuel to make there, so I needed to pick out exactly the right flight path, although the takeoff from high altitude made this a lot easier than it had been during testing. With plenty of fuel left, I made it back to the lander and was ready to rendezvous and head on over to Drace. Just in time, I noticed that I had almost neglected to make a visit to Duna's moon Ike. This would have been quite the omission because there are a lot of interesting things about Ike. Most notably, it is the largest moon in relative size to its parent body. Due to the low amount of delta V necessary here, I was able to use just the radial xenon tank in the Ion shuttle itself without using any of the auxiliary xenon tanks. The delta V requirement here is made low by the fact that both Duna and Ike are relatively small, and that I can aerobrake my way back down to a low Duna orbit. Ike's close proximity to Duna has a lot of interesting effects. Firstly, it means that it's very likely to irritate you if you try to get in a close approach to Duna, because Ike is very likely to be in the way. It also means that the two bodies are tidally locked, which means there is a point on Ike and a point on Duna, which are locked into a stare-down with each other for all eternity. After getting back into orbit around Ike, I was ready to go back to low Duna orbit, rendezvous with the main craft, and then make our way over to Drace. Because of the low size of Duna and Drace, most of the ejection burn had to be done in the final periapsis pass. This meant that the burns were longer than I was able to do on just the battery pack, and I therefore had to use the trickle from the RTG to do most of the burn. This meant that the burns here took the better part of an hour, but what surprised me here was that doing a lot of the burn so far away from the periapsis did not have that much of a negative effect on the efficiency of the burn. This was largely because of the small size of these planets meant that the Oberth effect was not as significant. The Oberth effect refers to the greater efficiency a rocket engine has when near a gravitational body. This occurs because falling into the gravitational well of a body increases your relative velocity. Impulse is a linear relationship with velocity, whereas kinetic energy has a square relationship with velocity. Therefore, doing your burn close to a gravitational body increases the efficiency of the rocket engine. Drace seems to get overlooked as a destination quite a lot of the time, which I find strange because it is on a very interesting inclined eccentric orbit, and the surface of it has all sorts of varied features. It has canyons, craters, there's patches of ice, and I'd highly recommend going there. I've had a lot of fun exploring the surface in past missions. We are now ready to redock with the lander, and having completed this leg of the expedition, we are ready to head back to the mothership and restock for our next expedition. The ejection from Drace back to Kerbin was the longest burn of this part, and one of the longest burns of the mission overall. I believe it took somewhere around an hour. I maximized efficiency during this long burn while using partial power on the Ion engine, just using the trickle off the RTG when approaching the planet, then using the power in the battery pack to use the Ion engine on full power when passing the periapsis. After the electrical power was expended, I went back to using just the trickle. As in the previous leg of the mission, I had plenty of excess delta V, and this push for efficiency was purely an academic exercise. In a detail I forgot about until right now, it was not until this point that the large Ion Tug used in the Eve stage in the mission was finally brought back and rendezvoused with the mothership. The injection for the Duna Drace expedition was done through a combination of retro-burning and aerobraking seen here. The spinning distributes the heat more evenly over the whole craft to prevent any single part of it from overheating. I had enough fuel that this easily could have been done with just retro-burning, but I think Jebediah enjoyed the carnival ride-like experience. With that stage of the mission complete, it was now time to move on to the third and final leg of the mission, which would go to Jool and Elo. With Jool, we would specifically land on its 5 moons, not the planet itself, because being a gas giant, there is no surface of Jool to land on. This stage of the mission required the 2 dedicated landers for Lathe and Tylo respectively, which made this the heaviest of the 3 major legs of the mission. The Kerbin to Jool route is one of the more dramatic examples of how helpful gravity assists can be. A direct burn from Kerbin to Jool will cost you about 2,000 meters per second delta V, whereas with careful use of gravity assists it can be done for less than 1,100 meters per second. This mission will use the Kerbin, Eve, Kerbin, Kerbin, Jool route. That will mean I will first do a flyby of Eve, which will turn my inclination relative to Eve into prograde velocity, throwing me onto a higher orbit that also rendezvous back on Kerbin. I will tune this flyby of Kerbin to put me on a resonant orbit with Kerbin. that will make me find another rendezvous with Kerbin on my next pass. Any flyby of Kerbin in this particular paradigm will push us onto a higher orbit, which is what we want. And after the second flyby of Kerbin, I have a direct rendezvous with Jool. Delta V is further saved by using a Tylo flyby to put us into a captured Jool orbit. I also make sure that this flyby puts me onto a rendezvous with Lathe, which will be the first moon of Jool that we will visit. Thanks to our gravity assist off of Tylo, our relative velocity to Lathe is low enough that we can use aerobraking alone to capture in Lathian orbit. That means we can go from a Kerbin to Eve transfer orbit to the surface of Lathe using no significant delta V. Like with the Kerbin aerobraking, the craft is spun about in Lathe's atmosphere to spread out the heating over all sides of the craft. A lot of people will say this is inhumane to our poor Kerbal, but he still looks like he's enjoying it. Once in Lathian orbit, the Lathian lander is detached along with the Ion shuttle, which will act as a tug to push it back up into elliptical orbit after the landing. The target island for the landing is the same island I landed on in the previous video in the Odyssey by Bill series. This isn't critical for being able to reorbit. This craft is capable of reorbiting from sea level, but it's a fun island and it's got a nice crater in it that makes for a nice destination. The uphill on the landing approach allows me to easily slow down a lot before touching down, and I then coast up to the top of this mountain ridge, since, to put it in the words of Sir George Mallory, because it's there. Lathe is, along with Kerbin, one of the only two bodies with atmospheric oxygen present. This got me to thinking about the potential for life on Lathe. Oxygen is a highly electronegative and highly reactive gas, which means that it's very unlikely to exist in large quantity in the atmosphere if there isn't some kind of process sustaining it. While this process could be some kind of inorganic chemical reaction, I think photosynthesizing something is the best guess. With ponderings complete, it is now time to take off again and head back to orbit. With a Rapier engine and a very low mass, the TWR of this craft is through the roof, and it can therefore climb very quickly. And with the shielded docking port on the front, it can reach a very high speed while still using the air-breathing engine. This allows us to minimize the delta V done with the closed-cycle rocket burn, which makes this as efficient as possible. After a short burn into circular Lathian orbit, I then rendezvoused back with the Ion Tug and was ready to head back to the main craft. I realized at this point that while the Lathe lander had been designed to have the minimum wet mass, it might be possible to, with a different engine configuration, have a lighter dry mass, and since we have to push this craft all the way back to Kerbin, the dry mass is quite important. This might result in better efficiency overall, and it'll be something I look at if I decide to do a low mass version of this. Redocked with the Ion Tug, we can now push the Lathe lander back into a rendezvous with the main craft in elliptical Lathian orbit. Once redocked with the main craft, we will be ready to transfer to our next target, which will be Tylo. Elliptical orbits in the Julian system are very efficient, and it takes almost no delta V to move from elliptical Lathian orbit to an elliptical Tylo orbit. Our paradigm in Tylo will be very similar to what we had on Lathe, where the Ion Tug will detach with one of the dedicated landers, this time the Tylo lander. It will push it to a low Tylo orbit. The Tylo lander will then land on the surface to Tylo and make it back to a low Tylo orbit, where then the tug will rendezvous with the lander and then push it back into an elliptical orbit with the rest of the craft. Getting the Tylo lander separated with the proper tug parts turned into a confusing jumble of modules everywhere, but I eventually managed to get everything docked in the proper position and was ready to land. Tylo is unique in that it is a moon without any atmosphere, but is roughly equal in size to Kerbin. This makes landing on it very challenging because you need both a lot of delta V to get to the surface and all the way back up, as well as have a high enough TWR to overcome gravity. Having a lander that has enough fuel to make it all the way from low Tylo orbit to the surface and then back up without any staging requires a very dedicated craft. As you can see, this thing is pretty much just a fuel tank with an engine and a Kerbal strapped to it. On any moon, as soon as you go under orbital speed, you start losing energy due to gravity. Therefore, you maximize your efficiency by minimizing the time elapsed between when you leave orbit and when you land on the surface. This is particularly critical on Tylo because the gravity is so high. What I like to do is burn horizontally at first until I'm descending quickly towards the surface. Once I start nearing the surface, I'll begin to reduce my vertical speed until my vertical speed is 0 and I am moving parallel to the ground. I then burn off most of my horizontal speed while staying as close to the surface as possible, but making sure I don't start losing altitude and therefore hit the surface. If all is done right at the very end, you make sure that your altitude and your speed reach 0 at exactly the same time, and you've achieved a very efficient landing. You will note I intentionally landed in an area that is very high, which makes landing and taking off again very easy, although this isn't necessary, as in testing I was able to land and take off again from an area that was very low. Takeoff very closely mirrors what we did to land, where we pick up as much speed as possible horizontal close to the surface before burning into a circular orbit. Since we took off from a high altitude, we can stay level and not worry too much about hitting anything else. Once back in orbit, we head over to a rendezvous with the Ion Tug, and then back to an elliptical Tylo orbit and rendezvous with the main ship. You can note that the Ion Tug uses both of the auxiliary xenon tanks on this because it has to push the Tylo lander all the way down and all the way back up, whereas on Lathe it only had to push it one way due to the ability to aerobrake. After redocking the Tylo lander with the main ship, our next target will be Val. This means quite a bit of shuffling around of modules to get the Val lander put together. The Val lander will be somewhat unique in that it'll take both the Ion Tug and the additional Ion engine to land there. Because we need a big battery pack to land there, and because the gravity is relatively high for a moon, this made this the most challenging landing out of all the landings with the Ion lander. As with the Lathe to Tylo transfer, the Tylo to Val transfer takes very little delta V, and even a small burn is enough to achieve a rendezvous. One thing I did notice is that after reaching Val, I had the additional engine on the wrong side because I needed to detach the auxiliary fuel tank before landing. So this required a little bit of shuffling around, but Jeb was always up to the task, even if I was unwilling to give him musical montage this time. To maximize efficiency, I mimicked the approach that I demonstrated on Tylo, and because I always like aiming for a mountain, my destination will be the sharp ridgeline you see up ahead. While the Val lander was more of a challenge during the design phase, landing here was easier than it had been on Moho because the TWR was higher due to the second engine. I was briefly concerned that there might not be enough friction on the surface to prevent us from sliding all the way down into the valley, but we eventually came to a stop, and Jeb had some time to look around and ponder the magnificence of the mountain he had landed on. After this brief sightseeing, Jeb was ready to take off again. While taking off from a high elevation usually makes it quite easy to maintain a safe altitude from the ground, Jeb looked like he wanted to have a more spine-tingling experience, including one approach of a ridgeline that I wasn't sure would make it. After reaching orbit around Val, Jeb redocked with the auxiliary fuel tank and was ready to transfer back to Tylo. His rendezvous with Tylo needed to ensure that he was on the right side of Tylo, such that his periapsis would match that of the elliptical orbit of the mothership. This is easily achieved with Tylo, because you can just make sure that your intersection with Tylo's orbit is in the right spot, and then simply wait for a rendezvous to occur. Tylo's sphere of influence is so large compared to its semi-major axis around Joule that this rendezvous is very easy to get within merely a couple orbits. Having completed the inner Julian system, I was now ready to do the two adorable outer Julian moons. The auxiliary xenon tank is quite excessive for this task, but there isn't enough range in the basic Ion lander to do it, so it was necessary. Our first destination will be the outermost Julian moon of Pol. BOP may be known as the home of the deep space kraken from my previous video, but it is pole where he most often strikes. Very often when approaching the ground, the game can't seem to agree on where exactly the surface should be, and your ship will mysteriously decide to explode. Luckily, I did not encounter any kraken strikes on this mission, but I was ready to deal with them should they arise. Jeb decided that he rather liked the pole landscape, what with its rugged features and fairly cool-looking rocks. He therefore took the opportunity to do some mountaineering and head up to the top of the mountain. This was as good of a spot as any to rep the awesomeness of the Kerbal Space Program, and to let any deep space kraken around know that we were still ready to throw down. Jeb was ready to take off. Our next destination would be the moon BOP. Like many ascents on this mission, I made sure that I matched the inclination of the auxiliary fuel tank I had left in orbit. Despite this moon's small size, doing an orbital plane change can still become very expensive very quickly if you do not closely match the inclination of what you are trying to rendezvous with. Jeb then transferred from pole to the moon BOP and was ready to make a landing. This time I am landing with the auxiliary fuel tank, because I want to leave BOP on a polar orbit. This will offset the inclined orbit of pole when I find a rendezvous back with the mothership around Tylo. Jeb was sure to make sure that he planted the KSP flag on the home of the Kraken so it would know who was the real master of the Kerbal system. Having done all the moons of Jool, he was now ready to head back to the mothership and make his final landing on the planet of Elo. As with the Val to Tylo transfer, the BOP to Tylo transfer first reached an orbital intersection with Tylo, before waiting for a rendezvous several orbits later. This allowed me to match my periapsis to the elliptical orbit of the mothership again. Before heading over to Elo, it was time for the breaking of the Fellowship of the Modules. Since the dedicated Lathe and Tylo landers, along with the large Ion Tug, the large battery pack, and the additional ion engine were no longer necessary, those were flown directly back to Kerbin. The orbital period of both Jool and Elo are quite long, and therefore you sometimes have to wait quite a long time to get a good transfer window. As a result, this part of the ship actually reached home at Kerbin before the transfer window from Jool to Elo was open. Having waited more than a couple years, I now had reached the transfer window for Jool to Elo. Normally I would do this with a burn directly from orbit around Tylo into a Elo rendezvous. Due to the limitations, including the lack of electrical power, I decided to first burn into an elliptical Julian orbit before burning at the Julian periapsis into an Elo rendezvous. In order to save some time, I had actually transferred before the transfer window was truly open, and therefore needed a fairly sizable burn in deep space to reach a rendezvous with Elo. As with Drace, the injection burn at Elo was greater than I could do with a single use of the electrical energy stored in the battery. I therefore used the trickle of RTG energy on either side of the periapsis. This resulted in an injection burn that took the better part of 1 hour. Due to Elo's smooth surface, I was able to set my low orbit very low before doing my final landing approach. Due to Elo's low gravity, both of the auxiliary fuel tanks have been already sent back to Kerbin as they were not necessary here. Nearing the landing spot, Jeb passed over one of the craters that broke up the icy monotony, and because this was the last landing on this mission, Jeb decided to make it a good one. The goal here was to make sure that our altitude, horizontal speed, and vertical speed all reached 0 at the same time, and we'd slide smoothly into a landing. Having succeeded in his dangerous landing and lacking a thesaurus, Jeb decided to take a look around at the ice in the icy icebox he had landed on. He then decided to celebrate this landing with some EVA pack proximity flying. I don't think this is entirely KSC administration approved, but he certainly had a lot of fun. After draining almost all of the EVA fuel in his jetpack, he was ready to head back into orbit. The hooliganism was quite strong with Jeb at this point, and he promised that on his ascent up from the surface of Elu, that he would do a low pass that would make all the previous ones look like safe maneuvers. Luckily, the perfect ridge line for a close approach was right up ahead. The close pass was even closer than intended, coming within less than 3 meters of the planet's surface. Jeb thought this was a fine note to leave things on, and after burning back into a circular orbit around Eeloo, was ready to rendezvous with the crewed module and then head back to the planet Kerbin. The ejection burn back to the planet Kerbin was the longest of the mission so far, requiring quite a bit of patience on the part of your faithful narrator, even on 10 times physics speed. The injection burn to capture in the Kerbin system would break this record. Because I had no solar panels, I was still relying only off the trickle from the RTG and the electrical energy stored in the battery to slow down. I set my periapsis as far in the atmosphere as Kerbin as I dared, but I still needed well over an hour of actual time burning the ion engine to finally achieve a captured orbit in the Kerbin system. Once captured in the Kerbin system, I was home free, as I could use aerobraking in the atmosphere of Kerbin to lower myself down to a low Kerbin orbit, where I could then easily rendezvous back with the mothership. Nearing a rendezvous with the mothership, Jeb was anxious to get home and finally devour the banana cream pie that his wife had promised to him upon his return. At this point, Jeb received a call from home telling him that he better not forget about the obvious destinations of the Mun and Minmus. This is a good thing because while Jeb might not know about Reddit, I do, and I'm sure someone would have had something hilariously snarky to say about it if I had forgotten. Fortunately, there was gobs of extra fuel remaining, and since the Mun and Minmus are not particularly challenging to land on, he was able to easily use the modules available to put together a lander. To generally power a Mooner ion lander with solar power, I lacked the module to fully power the ion engine further out from Moho, and just went with the battery pack and the RTG. After dropping a token flag on the surface, we were ready to take back off again and head over to the moon of Minmus. After exhausting a final couple opportunities to make low passes to the surface, Jeb headed on up to a circular lunar orbit and made sure not to forget to rendezvous with the auxiliary fuel tank he had left. While there was some extra delta V on this expedition to the Mun and Minmus, I would probably have had to return to refuel between the two moons if I did not go through the process of leaving the auxiliary fuel tank in a circular orbit. The final landing of this mission would also be one of the easiest, so I decided to make somewhat of a challenge for myself by trying to land right on the edge of this cliff. I wasn't exactly on the lip of the cliff, but I do think it was close enough for government work. After touching down on the surface, Jeb took a moment to take in the delicious scenery that the moon provided. He noted that the terrain features that look so minuscule from orbit appear so colossal and massive when standing on the surface. Sharp-eyed viewers might note I am taking off in the opposite direction that I landed in. This is because I absent-mindedly captured on the wrong side of Minmus, and therefore was inclined 180 degrees in my orbit compared to literally everything else. Having remembered the forgotten moon, we approached the mothership for the last time for real this time. Jeb was in quite a rush to get home and finally get those snacks he had been thinking about the whole time, and neglected to put everything back in the same place that it had been on the ascent. This would pose some interesting problems when landing on the runway. Many of the SSTOs that I've used in my videos have used a shielded docking port on the front. This is a lot more resilient to heat than the shock cone on the front of this craft, and as a result I needed to be very careful to not overheat when descending down into Kerbin. As I approached the runway, I realized I was still heading too quick, and therefore I pitched the nose upward and down to slow down more. It was at this point I realized that the way the lathe lander was docked inside of the cargo bay was causing it to oscillate up and down quite a bit. I was concerned that when I landed on the runway, the impact of the rear wheels hitting would cause the lathe lander to swing downward and actually impact the runway. My solution to this problem was to minimize the vertical speed of the rear of the plane when landing on the runway. This was done by getting the rear wheels as close to the runway as possible, with a vertical speed of as close to 0 as possible. I then quickly set the nose down and gently had the craft back on the runway. The lathe lander swayed downward significantly when landing, but not enough to hit the runway, so this landing was a success. And that will conclude Jeb's grand tour. Jeb has landed on every moon and every planet with a surface to land on. He has done this in a single launch without any refueling from ISRU or other means. Most importantly, he has done this with all stock parts, and he has recovered all of the parts that he launched with the exception of the Eve lander. This was not really a low-mass attempt, and in fact he had more than 26,000 units of xenon fuel remaining. At some point I would like to do a low-mass version of this, but due to the large amount of effort necessary, it will not be for some time. I hope that all of you watching have enjoyed. If you have anything to say, please leave any comments, feedback, or suggestions below. If you like this and want to see more, please like and subscribe. And farewell, and don't do anything I wouldn't do.